Okay, two caveats before I start this tutorial. One, this is a modeling class, so I didn't anticipate doing something related to simulation. But the student has a really good reason for this, where they need a tablecloth for the scene that they're building, referencing this historical painting. It's really cool. And two, this is not meant to be like, here are all the tools. This is just meant to give you a taste of what the basic setup is, and I will leave it to you to dig into the documentation further. I am no Zen master when it comes to simulations, especially in Cinema 4D. So anyways, I've got three objects here. I've got a floor. I basically started with a table, right? This little cube is the table. And I duplicated that and gave me just a floor with a little thickness here. And I have a cloth object. Now, the floor and the table can stay in these the kind of primitive encapsulated form. The cloth object will have to be converted into a raw polygon object for it to work. So, but I'm going to leave this cloth here because I have the size here, but I have the resolution set to 10. I just wanted to show several points about this. So I'll duplicate that one, and I'll just disable the original. I'll come back to it and use it. All right, so I have this cloth here. It's named cloth, but it's not a cloth as far as a simulation. If I press play or any of these buttons, it doesn't do anything, right? It doesn't simulate. So I need to put a tag on it to tell Cinema 4D, hey, this thing has special magical properties. So I'm going to right click and go down to the simulation tags, and there's several in here about rigid and soft bodies and blah, blah, blah. But we have one defined just for cloth right off the bat. So I will put this on there. The other thing too, I didn't do this before, but I'm going to go ahead and hit C to make this a raw polygon object. And if I press play, look at that, it falls all the way through the ground, right? Perfect, done. Okay, so obviously it's a cloth object, but cloth needs to interact with things like the body, things like that. It is having gravity is working on it. We'll look here in the tag here in a minute under the forces, and look right there. We've got some gravity doing its thing. But it's not running into anything. So let's click on the table again and right click and go to simulation tags. And so instead of these being cloth objects, we want them to be things that the cloth can collide with, right? If you have objects way in the distance that aren't going to animate, why, no sense having the computer calculate collisions for something it's never going to run into, right? So these are the specific ones I want it to run into. This one here and the floor itself. And if I go back and just press play, you can see that it simulates across the surface. Probably not all that impressive, right? Because at this point, cloth is fabric, right? It has all these little bits of thread and everything. This is like, I don't know, a cloth object if it was aluminum foil or something, right? And the problem is it just doesn't have a lot of subdivisions in it, right? So I could go back to if I just reset the simulation up here, I could go back to the cloth object and just duplicate it again if I wanted to, and maybe start with a different number of subdivisions. But since I already have this one here, so we can, in fact, you know what, let's do that. I'm going to put the simulation tag on it as well. So when I duplicate it, I get the same thing. And this time, instead of 10 segments, let's make it active so we can see it. Let's make this 100 segments, right? Okay, so that's a lot. And I'll go ahead and hit C. So we've got that in there. And then I'll just go ahead and press play in the simulation. And you can see it's going kind of slow. It's also got a lot of little noise and little errors. There's just so much detail for it, which is sometimes not a bad thing. It's also doing some weird drapery stuff. We need to fix some of those settings. So finding a middle balance is a good place, especially as you're trying to get a feel for how all this works. So I'm going to delete that one and go back up to the cloth, and I'll duplicate it one more time. And this time, I'll just set it halfway in between, so 50 and 50, right? Now, I could have just taken the raw object and subdivided it if I was in polygon mode. I could right click and say subdivide, right? And it would split each one of these polygons into 2 halves, right? So it would make 1 polygon 4 polygons. But right now this seems reasonable. And it simulates pretty quickly. You get the basic look and flow. You can see it's kind of sliding off the table there. It's like it's some weird silk or something like that, right? It's also not very smooth. The basic simulation setup of it is okay. But let's see what we can do to make this at least a little bit better. We're probably not going to get perfect, but the other thing is we have just a sheet, like a very thin, but any piece of cloth is going to have at least a little thickness to it. So I'm going to go up to the Subdivision Surface Generator menu, and you can see, once again, we have a cloth thingy, right, a cloth generator. So I'll just put the cloth inside of it. And so this adds, even though the simulation is based on these raw ones, the cloth subdivides to kind of smooth out some of that so we don't get jagged things. So the balance is, how can I get a smooth final result without having it subdivided so much that the simulation takes forever to do? The other thing too is we can add a little bit of thickness, right? So there's, obviously probably don't want our cloth to be like that. We could even try 0.66 maybe or something, right? Relatively thin, but it has a little bit of thickness to its comforter or something like that. Or some kind of cloth. If a comforter probably would be that, probably be this one, right? Let's just go with this, 0.66. So I'm getting a smoother result if I were to play this, right? And it's kind of a version of the subdivision surface, right? Yeah, what's going on. So it's not bad. It's got some weird little results. And all this comes down to the settings, right? How stiff is the fabric? How much can it flex? What's the mass of it? How big is this object in Cinema 4D world space, right? So there's a lot of different settings in here. And what settings I'm going to show here might not work as well for you. Depends on what the size of your object and the subdivisions and how big it is and all that other stuff. So let's start with the table. For one, it's kind of sliding off the table, so I don't want it to do that. I'm going to assume that my table's this kind of rough wood or something. So once I put the tablecloth on, it's not prone to moving around. So I'm going to actually make this more like, I don't know, 80. So it has a lot of friction and maybe not as much bounce, right? I don't really need this to any kind of bounce to happen. I need it to kind of stick a little bit more. So the table's doing that. I now have the same thing with the cloth needs a little more stick to it, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. I guess I'll do the same here. What did I do? 10 and 80. Is that what I did for the other? Okay, so now let's look at the cloth itself. Very important. So iterations, I haven't looked at the documentation, but I'm assuming, in fact, let's do a little test here. Right? Okay, so around 51 frames. This is what we're getting with one iteration. So let's turn this up to, I don't know, 3. And you can see this seems a little bit smoother, right? So the iterations is as the solver's figuring out, and there's like little mathematical springs in between all these things, the points on here, right? Well, these points. So it's like a smoothing, or a redoing of these calculations. So it's doing a pretty good job, and depending on your scene, like what you're looking at, that might be something that's pretty close to perfect, right? Maybe you don't have to show, maybe you're not worried too much about the bottom down here. But I will continue just a little bit. Let's just at least explore. Stiffness, I'm going to leave there. This Flexion is, you can experiment with this. And I really think if you're trying to figure out, well, what are all these settings do? Just pick one, go through them one at a time. So here's 0. Right? So you can see that these are really bunching up on each other, right? So let's go back and turn this to 100. So we can see it at full power. What does that do for me, right? So mathematically, it's flexing, right? It's trying to say, hey, get off me. Don't get too close to me. So it's getting a little more relaxed. We have a few places where it's not working as well. Maybe I'll turn that down to something like 80. Let's turn the bounce down to 5, and let's make the friction more like 85. I don't know. So obviously I would go through each one of those and kind of mess with it. But you can see by turning up those settings, it's not like satin, or silk or something like that. This is a little more thick. I mean, it has thickness, and I want it to be a tablecloth. So this is a decent setup. Let's put this back at the top. So what you could do is just simulate it until it falls into that state. And then we could right click on this. Current state to object. Let's see what we've got here. We just got a full cloth object, right? Just like that. And I could let's hide this one. And I could take this, and if I wanted to add a little more smoothing, maybe I just put it in the subdivision surface, and I don't need it to be cloth anymore. Right, and I get a smooth, look at how that folds real pretty. Right? So there you have, once I have it kind of in that state, I can get rid of everything else. I don't need to run a simulation on it anymore. It's just now a frozen piece of geometry. And that has a nice little cloth look to it, right? Obviously, because it has a little material, the default material, it has a nice satiny sheen on it. So the resolution's kind of important. You can see where it's bulging just a little bit here on those edges. If I want it to really conform to that surface, I need to have more resolution to be able to do that. But anyways, this is not bad, and certainly easier than having to model this yourself, right? So a little cloth simulation tutorial. I hope that's helpful.